company that may want to index your data is Google. They want all of your data. I imagine a conversation at Google when they first started indexing, when they said, we're going to get all the information in the world, we're going to put it all together this big search engine, and people refer to it on the news. And somebody said, wait a second, a lot of data is stored on computers, personal computers, that we don't have access to. And so he said, no problem, we'll get them to send it to us. So you'd never know what they're doing with it. You don't know who they sell it to. You know if they aggregate it and sell it, if they sell it individually. And this is a problem of control and transparency. Search warrants. A Fourth Amendment search warrant requires probable cause. That is a standard that they can usually make, but there's something called the Stored Communications Act, and there's a 2703 order, excuse me, 2703D order. The important part of that is that it requires what are called specific and articulable facts. The data is relevant or material. That's not that hard. Now, there's a prior notice requirement in the SCA. They have to tell you ahead of time if they're going to take your data, except that it can be postponed for 90 days. It's not really prior notice anymore. So this guy looks like a child pornographer. Can we just agree? He was. His name is Richard S. Goldberg. I will point out right now, I am Richard P. Goldberg. We are not related. So this guy was running around with this, doing child pornography, and he was on the run. He was on the FBI most wanted list for, I don't know, 6 years or something like that. He was captured. But imagine that he was using your cloud service provider. The FBI finds out, and they issue a search warrant. They go to every single data center, and they take everything. The problem is that, unlike certain investigations, child porn investigations involve contraband. FBI can't let these things out. They can't just say, oh, we'll just take a copy. Keep your child porn on your own. And so they will back up a truck and take everything. This could shut down your business. Something very similar happened in Texas, and I asked a friend of mine who's an assistant U.S. attorney, not in Texas, but elsewhere, I won't tell you where, and I said, look, you have this, this hypothetical, there's a child porn ring, and you find out that they are storing this stuff in this cloud service provider. You know that there's no way to take this stuff without shutting down not just the cloud provider's business, not their fault, right? But because we don't want them looking at our data, but also every business that uses it. And they're not going to have any notice. It's just going to shut down like that. Would you do that? Seems to me they'd have to. And he was my friend went to the person in charge of the district, and he asked him directly the same question, and I got a very direct answer. I'm quoting, no comment. So what do you think they're going to do? So will your cloud provider agree to help? Let's just look at one. They're kind of long and dense. You acknowledge they may disclose your content when it's necessary to comply with a legal request or to protect the rights of the public. It may just be gone. And the problem with this is that, it's sudden. And you have no notice of it, and it just kills you. Okay, so are there any solutions? Yes and no. First, you need to demand transparency. You need to know who's running the cloud provider and what they do. Google has been contracted by Los Angeles, and if you're Los Angeles, you can negotiate these things. Smaller companies, small organizations can't yet, but cloud computing is changing, and we'll get increased transparency. Just like everything, providers will have to start taking some amount of responsibility, though there's a question about how much. If you've ever gone skiing or rented any motorized device, you know that you sign away your life. And that hasn't changed. But I think for sophisticated businesses, it will change. You also need to demand control, and these are all just subjects of negotiation. So what are the details? Remember, the goals are control and transparency. So first, you want advance notice if your data is going to be released. If there's a subpoena, they're not instant, and so you want to know ahead of time so you can contest it. Second, you want prompt notice of a breach. This includes if the FBI shows up. It includes if there is a breach and they don't know if your data was leaked. You still want to know so you can be on the lookout for it. You don't want them to say, well, it's probably fine, no risk of harm. We're not going to tell you. Third, the data is yours, it is not theirs, and they have no right to sell it. They can use it only to the extent that they need to use it to figure out if their service is working. It also means they shouldn't be able to hold it hostage if you don't pay them, or if they think you don't pay them. It should just be off the table. Fourth, you want a clear data retention policy. You want to know what they're doing with backups, what they're doing with deletions, how that stuff works. And you need to, if you can, get them to implement a policy that's at least as good as yours. Finally, you want some sort of audit rights. Now, there may be standards bodies that are created that will do independent audits, and you won't have to. But your company may want to do audits on its own. Mark Twain once said that, well, to paraphrase him, first God created idiots. That was for practice. And then he created standards bodies. But it may be useful. We don't know yet. But this does not solve all of our problems. For instance, they may just not notify you even though they're required to. That's no less a business risk even though you can sue them for it. Right? Your data's still gone. Second, they may just not adhere to their policies. Even if you do audits, they may not adhere to them, because after all, you only do audits every so often. Third, there's just nothing you can do about a data seizure or failure except to diversify your risk. But that was the point of cloud computing in the first place, right? These people were supposed to take this problem off your hands. They do backups, they do scaling. Problem is, they may screw up. Fourth, you don't know who's accessing your data. They have employees, they may have bad security, they may have employees that get angry when they get fired. It's not like nobody's ever been laid off and stolen data. And you don't know what'll happen to it. You don't know what their procedures are for figuring out who's a good employee and who's not. And finally, they may still hold your data hostage. This happened to me once when I was running a website. I had an argument with a company and they said, look, you either pay us extra or we're not going to give back your data. I said, screw off. But if your data is important to you, then you're screwed. So remember, the key issues are a lack of control and a lack of transparency. And to the extent that when you're in the cloud, you can fix that, you're in a lot better shape. Thank you. So I'll take questions if there are people watching and want to do it via Twitter. I'll pull my phone out. That's my Twitter name. Questions? Okay, you were first.
Yeah, I can see how some of this would be a weed by making sure you always encrypt to the cloud and decrypt from the back, but it won't address everything. I was wondering what your feelings are about how much safer that makes the cloud.
Well, if you're just storing data, then you could encrypt it before you send it, right? If you're using it for software as a service, for instance, it can be encrypted there, and it can be encrypted when it's transmitted, but those are not the same encryption, right? And so it's going to have some processing time where it's available. So it's dangerous there. But if it's stored encrypted and you hold the key, you're much better off. If the provider offers encryption, which you think they should, then they hold the key. So the question is, where's the key, right? If their employees have access to the key, they may store it on a Post-it note. Well, not key, but they can store it somewhere where people can get to it. And so it's better, but it's good if somebody loses a laptop, although I don't know why your data would be on a laptop when you're having a cloud provider, but they do weird things, and you still have the same problem. So yeah, encryption's better, but you still have some of these problems. And if the provider has access to it, they can still do all the things. Plus, search warrants, subpoenas do not protect them. If you have the key, the FBI will say, give us the key. And you'll have to. It's the same thing in a civil suit.
When you say if you have the key, the cloud provider has to give them the key, or the owner of the data has to give them the key?
Whoever has the key will give them the key. The FBI will order it, or a court will order it, or in a subpoena, a court will order it. You'll have to give it up. You can't say, oh, I don't know, I lost it. I'm sorry, what do you mean?
In other words, can a cloud provider say that the data for some reason isn't yours?
You might agree that it's right. You might sign a negotiated agreement that says you agree that that you're giving us ownership of data and you're now licensing it back, for instance.
They're different. Data is just not one big bucket where you say, wow, that's data. You can have, okay, so here's our data, which is actually records that we hold in a database table, but then there's data about that data. So metadata, which would be network traffic analysis, things like that. That's a gray area. Who owns that? So they're like your data, the stuff that you create, you put up there. Yeah, that's most likely yours. But then this other stuff around it probably belongs to the service provider.
But they may. When you say submit something to a magazine, sometimes they'll take ownership of the data, and you have a license to reprint it or something.
Right,
like
but
that.
for example, if I do a Google search and I did 10,000 Google searches over the last 3 years, one could say that data, those searches, are my data.
Which data?
The actual search itself.
You mean the data about the search or the results of the search?
The actual text string
Okay.
into a search. I can say it's my data.
Okay, you could say that.
So my question is, Google would probably say, no, it ain't.
Right.
We're giving you a service for basically for free.
Right.
So in those cases, who really owns that data?
That is probably owned by Google, but
I'm sorry?
that's probably owned by Google. But there are harder cases. I mean, the harder cases are when you give them your data and say, and they use it in software as a service. There's a lot going on. It's the transactions that they're creating, and who owns the transaction logs, because they may want, if it's e-commerce, for instance, they may want to figure out who's buying what. So it depends on what you agree to. With the jacket and then the.
Yeah, I had a question about one of the companies you seem to be picking on some was Google, and since we're in Washington, D.C., Google seems to be putting on a push to get federal agencies like you were talking about for Los Angeles. And were any of those terms disclosed? I mean, is any of that public information that is, and do you have any comments about that agreement with Los Angeles and Google about specifically about what you discussed?
Right. It's not. I was at a party, I think a Christmas party at my friend and client Sean's house. I have a Plurry Center right there, and I was talking to the CISO for a big government agency, who has a lot of data you probably don't want out, and he was saying that the head of the agency wanted to put their data on Google Docs, and the lawyers were flipping out, and so we just stopped talking to the lawyers. LA probably negotiated a good deal. The actual terms were in public. They talked about it in the news. They said they have full transparency. They said they get to do audits. They have supposedly their own, what you might think of as a private cloud. It's hard to say what really is a private cloud. And it's different for government entities because they're subject to, for instance, federal government's subject to FOIA. There are similar state requirements. I'm sorry, the Freedom of Information Act. It's for private companies where these things, the government's not likely to seize government data. And when they get sued, they usually have to give it up anyway. And you don't really want your government destroying data unless it's sensitive. So for government agencies, the real concern is that it may get out, the sort of security threats that we normally talk about. For private companies who can make these deals, you have all these problems, and it's a trade-off. Much of business is a trade-off, and you decide whether it's a good business decision, whether it saves you enough money to put all this stuff at risk. Random. No, behind you.
So a lot of the questions you raised seem to be similar questions to folks that have been dealing with outsourcing and virtualization providers and risk providers for a long time. I'm sure you ask this question a lot. What do you see as the sort of specific increased risk provider versus the same kind of risk provider issues we've been dealing with for a long time?
Sure. There are a few things. The first is that there's sort of a rush to do this. And companies really aren't stopping to figure out the way they would with regular third parties outsourcing, what deals they're making. They're, actually going to Google Docs. And they're just not investigating what these problems are. The other thing is that it's getting bigger, right? There are always these, you have a third party here, you have a third party here. But when all of your stuff is out in the cloud, and all of everybody else's stuff is out in the cloud,